Welcome again to our frequent podcast called Wear Many Hats, inspired by Ethan Hawkey. Throughout the year, I, David Punter, the Business Development Director for Hawkey Cleaning and Support Services, shall be interviewing prominent facilities management and subject matter experts across a range of industry market sectors. It is these people with their wealth of knowledge and experience that will inspire the next generation of young professionals. Our objective is to share our guests' stories and experiences to help motivate, engage, and inspire others into the industry. Through Wear Many Hats podcast, we hope our listeners will gain new perspectives, insights, and learn about strategies to develop their careers in facilities management or procurement business. It gives me great pleasure to introduce
James Sinclair.
And you're from, James?
I am a director at Verisk Maplecroft.
Thank you, James, for joining us today. So without further ado, it leads me to my first set of questions that I would like to ask you, James. So, James, I want to understand a little bit about your journey and how you entered into a career in procurement.
It's sort of a long, tortuous journey, and I'm not entirely sure that I work in procurement. I work in sustainable procurement and human rights, which is a sort of sub-genre, I suppose. But if I start about what we do now, and then I kind of work backwards, I know
that's great.
Is that all right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what we do at Maplecroft is essentially two things. We provide industry-leading sustainability data, looking at everything from human rights and sustainable procurement to environmental matters, to governance issues, to political risk, to country risk. And this is a data set we've been building for over 20 years, which is really sort of methodologically deep and sound. And we have clients all over the globe that subscribe to that data set in order to be able to understand their risks better. So when they're thinking about what their supply chains look like, what their operational footprint looks like, how they can do better from an environmental perspective, from a human rights perspective, they use our data as a sort of first port of call.
Okay.
And then people like me, as sort of subject matter experts, come in and help advise those companies and take that data to embed it within their companies and think about the process of business transformation that's needed in order to make sure they're compliant, or not just compliant, but they're going beyond compliance with the new human rights and environmental due diligence laws, which is very much my sort of area of expertise. So business and human rights and HREDD stuff is very much my kind of bailiwick.
Okay. So journeying back then into your, before you got to where you are today, I understand you read at King's College. So,
yeah,
is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose we're going back that far. Yeah, so, that's how far you really want to go. I mean, I left school at 16.
Okay. This is what we like, the bit of the gritty stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
James.
Yeah, right. I mean, with no qualifications at all. I mean,
okay.
And I'd like to say that was just on account of being a little bit thick, but actually, I had a bit of a bad run of it in my teens. So various issues sort of came together, and I wanted to leave home and school as quickly as I could. So I went out and made my way in the world.
So it wasn't running away, joining the circus, James?
Not quite. Although it has felt a bit like that since. I worked in various sort of manual jobs, driving trucks, doing scaffolding, working in warehouses, etc. And then, sort of as I turned 20, I was also playing drums in a rock band, which we'll maybe come back to at some point. But then I turned 20, and I realised that I had something resembling a brain that I needed to do a little bit more with. So I ended up enrolling in a college course called an Access program for adult learners. And I discovered a taste for it. I suddenly found myself, absorbing all of this literature and this learning that I'd kind of denied myself, or had been denied to me for many years. And I just threw myself into it. And so very quickly, I decided this was going to be my future, and ended up getting a good enough mark on that course to go to York University, first of all, to study philosophy, politics, economics, the dreaded PPE that everyone now thinks ill of, thanks to Boris Johnson and David Cameron, etc. But I love that degree. I have to say, it was such an interesting, sort of broad-ranging introduction into the way we're governed and all that sort of stuff. So I absolutely love that, and had a great time at York.
So that you were in your 20s then, right?
Yeah, I was 22 when I went to York, yeah.
Okay.
And I left with a decent degree and got a scholarship to go to law school, which I did initially at York and then in London, just around the corner from here in Chancery Lane. And got another scholarship to become a barrister, because by this point I'd sort of got up a bit of a head of steam and thought, well, why not? And ended up doing pupillage here in London. And then for various family reasons, I ended up moving to Jersey in the Channel Islands. When I was, 27 or 28 or something. And stayed there for 5 years, working as a lawyer. Which then kind of leads into the next phase of my story, which was I met a guy called Tristan Forster, who'd been a Gurkha officer in the British Army. Believe me, there is a story behind this. And Tristan and his sort of his friends and his comrades had left the army and were working in Iraq and Afghanistan in the private security business.
Okay, he was actually Nepalese.
No, he was a Brit.
Okay.
But as is the way with the Gurkhas, at least historically, and I think to some extent still now, you typically have British officers go to Sandhurst who then end up being assigned to the Gurkhas and taking leadership
doing
positions
the recruiting and things like that.
Well, they become company commanders and whatever. They go to Nepal, they learn how to speak Nepalese, and they become the leaders of the sort of the Gurkha battalion. So,
okay.
Yeah, so anyway, we got talking and he explained to me some of the challenges he was seeing in Iraq, which, I mean, obviously then there was a war zone, right? There was a lot of really, really bad stuff going on across the board. But one of the things that was particularly exercising him was this idea that a lot of his former Gurkha soldiers had been had left the army and then gone back into Iraq in the private security game as he had. But the Nepalese guys were often being quite badly exploited financially on that journey. So they were having to pay quite large fees to access that work. Mm-hmm. And whilst they could often look after themselves, it became quite clear quite quickly that process of what we would now understand as bonded labor or debt bondage was absolutely the business model that pervaded right the way across, particularly South Asia, most of East Africa, and the Gulf. So if you're a migrant worker looking for work in that area, you are very likely to have to pay a very significant amount of money for your job. Mm-hmm. So Tristan and I got talking about this, along with Tristan's brother, Nick, and others, and we looked at whether there was any sort of legal or political pressure we could try and bring to bear to raise this issue, because it seemed like an obvious one of corruption and intimidation and malpractice and all that sort of stuff. But of course, there was a war going on. In fact, there were two wars going on, and so there wasn't much interest in trying to protect migrant workers. So we, in a fit of sort of naivety, we thought we would set up what I think was the world's first dedicated commercial ethical recruitment service, dedicated initially for Nepalese security workers, but then it broadened out to other facilities management, engineering, oil and gas, and now operates in several countries around the world. And that model of what's sometimes known as the employer pays model or the fair recruitment model has now been sort of widely adopted within the UN bodies, the ILO. We won a UN award for that work in 2013.
Okay.
But all the way through, I spent a lot of time working in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in East Asia, South Asia, East Africa, and the Gulf, across everywhere for many years. But I didn't really feel like I understood the problem well enough, even though we'd been the ones at the coalface of really kind of getting under the skin of it.
Yeah.
So that eventually led me to I set up a law firm to advise on this stuff. But again, I still felt like I was slightly freestyling it. So I ended up eventually, when I turned 40, coming back to the UK to do my PhD, which was in business and human rights, and with a specific focus on sustainable procurement and human rights and business and human rights. So that, having done that, I ended up then eventually finding my way to Maplecroft. So that's the sort of potted history. There's also some interesting chat about music in there somewhere, but I've glossed over that a bit.
Well, we can go back to that. So your PhD was
at King's.
That was at King's.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned a lot about the Gurkha stuff, because of course some of that's issues with regard to Gurkhas and how they've been treated is still very prevalent today with their impingement rights.
Yeah,
what's your view on that?
I mean, that's an interesting one, and the history of that is quite nuanced. And I don't really know enough about it in depth to offer too much of an opinion. I know a reasonable amount, but this is one of those areas that you've really got to nail it, right? And I don't want to offend anyone, but my understanding of it essentially is this. So before Hong Kong was returned, it sounds like a bit of a non sequitur here, but before Hong Kong was returned to the Chinese in 1997, before that deal was done.
Yeah. The 100-year lease.
Right, exactly. The Gurkhas essentially were recruited out of Nepal and worked out of Hong Kong. And so when they finished their tours of duty with the UK, the British Army, they went back to Nepal. And there was never any question that they would settle in the UK. And so their pensions were set at levels that were appropriate for
their
Nepal.
country.
Right. So then what happened after 97 is that the Gurkhas were headquartered in the UK, in Catterick and in various other places. And so you had this reasonable expectation that they would retire into the UK.
Yeah.
So there was this period of time when they were retiring as ex-Gurkhas, but still only being paid Nepalese-rated pensions, even though they were living in the UK.
Okay.
That was obviously wrong. And so that was fixed quite quickly. Then there was a second fight about the people who had retired before 97, who were back in Nepal, and to what extent they should also be paid UK-rated pensions, even though they were in Nepal.
Okay.
And so and my understanding is that fight has also essentially been fixed in their favour, as it should be. I mean, these are incredibly brave soldiers who have given their lives in many cases to the British Army. So
yes, it was interesting because there will be listeners here. I mean, I'm sure that we'll try and get Joanna Lumley as a really big supporter of this particular area as well to maybe add comment on it.
Can I just add to that? I mean, I talked about FSI as an international business. We also have a UK business as FSI, which very much does focus on facilities management and security and soft services. So
that's within your company.
Yeah, within. Well, so when I talk about my company, I'm talking about FSI. I no longer have an executive role at FSI.
Right.
I'm still a small shareholder, but that company is UK based, and we employ quite a large number of ex-Gurkhas who are fantastic people who provide amazing service. So a shout out to FSI Europe and to Dan O'Donnell and his team. They do amazing work, they're an absolute example to us all in terms of their professionalism.
Great. I mean, it's a really exciting journey, and I think it's comforting, certainly for some of our listeners, to almost realise that you left school at 16, but then suddenly had this kickstart of academia, of which you've gone to at great lengths with. So clearly, something happened. For you to do multiple degrees and stuff and multiple sort of qualifications, and also play a hand at the drums as well, I believe.
Yeah. I'll come to that in a second. I'm really passionate about this. I think that we write people off far too early in this country. Whether it's, I know the 11 plus isn't really a thing much anymore, but we look to pigeonhole people through these rather arbitrary tests that we put them through, whether it's at 14, 16, 18, 21, whatever.
Yes.
And then we say, right, that's you done for the rest of your life. And I think that's an incredible waste of talent, because I didn't realize until I was in my early 20s that I had a talent for academia. I didn't realize until I was well into my 30s that business and human rights was my calling. And I'm still learning now. I'm still taking whatever courses I can. I'm still looking to try and improve what I can. And also I want to give back. So just this weekend, I was a judge at a young social enterprise competition up in North London with Dan Amrusi and his team, because I'm really passionate about trying to help and inspire younger people to think that, whatever their start in life, that actually there's always an option. There's always an option to move forward. I feel that very strongly. And when I was at King's doing my PhD, I'd look around and there'd be people in their 60s and 70s who were doing degrees, having retired. And I always had immense respect for that, because there's no need for them to do it, but they're doing it out of pure love of the subject, and they get so much out of it. And I think we need to think about lifelong learning in a much more holistic way than we've ever done.
Definitely.
But on the drums point, do you want to make that?
Yeah, I know you're itching to talk about the drums point, so I think it's a really good one to say that you've got another side to your your brain, as it were, in terms of the creative side as well as the academia side.
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting that. I mean, I don't know where it started. My brother played the drums when I was very, very small. I have an older brother and two older sisters. And one of my earliest memories is my brother playing the drums quite badly and my dad getting really annoyed about it. And then he gave it up quite quickly. And then when I was about 6 or 7, I started picking it up. And I think much to my parents' annoyance. But it turned out that it was something that I naturally was pretty good at. I say that with a certain amount of modesty, but I got good at it quite quickly. And so at the age of sort of 10, 11, 12, I got into bands and we were doing little tours and recording little, albums and whatever. And then, it sort of spiraled. I ended up doing, okay on the kind of session scene in London as a drummer. And then in York, I got into a very good band there, and then, funnily enough, in Dubai, just at the point at which I thought, okay, I'm going to have to, give up on my rock star dreams, because Dubai is not the place you go if you're looking to start a music career, right? And I was in a bar one night and got talking to some guys, and it turned out that they had a band. In fact, they not only had a band, they had a band that was on MTV. And they needed a drummer because their drummer just left. So I ended up auditioning for them, and they got into that band. And on our third gig, we got signed to Sony and put out an album, and ended up opening on a stadium show for Guns N' Roses, and then for.
So what was the album called?
Empires. The band is Juliana Down. If you get, I don't think the album is still on Spotify, but there is one of our singles is still on Spotify, and the videos are still on YouTube. But so there's a video of us opening up for Maroon 5 on there, and yeah, so that was great fun. We did that for 2 or 3 years, or actually more than that, in Dubai. And I still play it. In fact, I was playing last weekend with my covers band here in London, and it's one of those things that I play the piano as well. But I mean, I don't do these things because I'm trying to achieve anything, but because they're amazing things to do in and of themselves, and it's always given me a great deal of satisfaction. Some of the best people I know are musicians, right? And they're the hardest working, most honest people I know, because they're doing it for the love of it. I've never met many musicians that I don't like. They tend to be good sorts.
I mean, it's just a very interesting sort of a side. I don't want to be rude, but it's a sideline to your career.
Sure, yeah.
But it's something that you actually get a lot of satisfaction out of. Just moving on to my second question.
It's only the second question.
Is just wanted to get a little bit of an understanding. What is it you like about your role that you're doing at the moment?
There's lots of it. I mean, I suppose I can sort of break that down into several things. So for a start, I have a great team, right? Okay. Really, really fantastic.
How big is your team?
So there's 120 of us at Maplecroft, thereabouts. Okay. The Sustainable Procurement and Human Rights team is only 8 of us.
Okay.
But we pack a pretty good punch across that, and we're geographically spread out a bit. The team here in London is sort of 30 or 40 of us in a lovely office in Bishopsgate. So the team's great, and I think that's often underestimated, because you go in every day and you meet people you like and you get on with, and they're unbelievably smart. These are people who make, I'm nowhere near some of these guys in terms of their capabilities, whether it's from computer science or environmental science, whatever. They're just awesome. So there's all of that. The team's great. The subject matter is just fascinating. So we've moved from a space where when I started getting involved in the business and human rights world 15, 16 years ago, we would get what I might euphemistically call a polite audience for our offering. People would say yes, 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 and nod, and then sort of carry on as usual. And we kept saying to people that there will come a point when the law will change and the commercial norms will change, and you'll be required to think about sustainability in a much more kind of holistic way. That moment has arrived, and it's unbelievably satisfying, because we're seeing the laws change at great speed. We're seeing commercial norms changing at great speed. So being at the sort of cutting edge of all of that, with a deep history in it, with an understanding of what business and human rights law and human rights and environmental due diligence stuff is all about, is fantastic. So there's the sort of being in the substantive part of it. Okay. And then there's the kind of nuts and bolts of my day job, which I get to do webinars and podcasts and speeches and all that kind of really good outreach stuff, which I love. I also get to advise, still in kind of a quasi-legal way around a lot of what we do. So still that intellectual challenge is still there. There's just. We think about the intersection of all of the things that we think about: politics, economics, law, environmental science, human rights, procurement. All of this stuff is just intellectually really challenging. And every day there's a new problem. We have clients all over the world. Some of the biggest companies in the world are our clients, and trying to help them fix their problems or get better at what they're doing, and all of the kind of intersectional issues that involves is just a fantastic challenge. So every day you're
the only thing I would say, and this is it's a throwaway comment from a business development person, but you don't really have any KPIs there, though, do you?
We do, actually. I mean, so
it doesn't matter if you don't achieve it. It's just like you've given a bit of bad advice.
No, I don't think that's so. I think there's several KPIs that we have. So obviously, internally, we're looking at our own commercial performance.
Okay.
And our parent company Verisk in the US, is very keen on us understanding in detail exactly how we allocate our time and what we're doing. So there's an internal efficiency bit that is definitely a KPI from our perspective.
Yeah.
We're absolutely passionate about making sure our clients are not just happy with our service, but delighted with our service, and we measure that. And so, understanding exactly what we're doing when we've made a mistake, we want to learn, we want to get better at it. Actually, the product delivery from our perspective, whether it's risk assessments, impact assessments, environmental science assessments, this stuff is really high quality stuff. And we're benchmarking ourselves all the time against our competitors, making sure that we're absolutely on the money where we need to be.
Do you have a lot of competitors?
Yes and no. So yes, in as much as there's lots of people out there offering their consultancy service, but and in that sense, we're one of many. But our data set is unique.
Okay.
So no one else has the data that we have in the depth and the breadth and the granularity that we have. Okay. So in that sense, we offer a fairly sort of unique service. But the fact that we've got both the data and the advisory is again unique. It makes us more expensive than some of our rivals because it's if someone is offering just a sort of pure consultancy play and they're getting their data from the internet, you can do that much cheaper than maintaining the sort of data set that we have.
I mean, it was interesting. You say you're slightly more expensive and stuff like that, but it sort of I would ask the question. You've got some sort of swanky offices in Bishopsgate.
Right.
Is that a sustainable office?
Yeah, it's brand new. So it's the one.
So does that mean it's sustainable?
Yeah, absolutely, because everything new is sustainable, right? No, I mean, I don't know. I mean,
Did you check?
Yeah, well, we did actually. So there are all kinds of elements. This is 22 Bishopsgate, the tallest of the towers.
I know.
The multiplex
very big building.
Yeah. And
taking airspace.
Yeah, right. And there are lots of really
out things into the atmosphere.
Fumes in the atmosphere. Yeah. I mean, we've got to work somewhere, right? But I mean, there are lots of ways in which we're constantly being told that the building is sort of super high performance and the rest of it. So, we ultimately we are one part of the Verisk business unit, which we have the 27th floor of that office. Maplecroft is one sort of corner of that, and
so just a little corner of that big swanky building.
Little corner of the big swanky building, exactly right. That's us.
Okay. I was just interesting to know because obviously there are organisations and we all talk about sustainability and I really want to sort of like push under the stone a little bit and just see, how far does that stretch back in your organisation from, the ordering of a paperclip to, having a big swanky office in Bishopsgate. So I just want to put it out there really.
We don't print paper, no.
Okay. So just a little bit. So what if you were to say someone you're in a very, very unique sector and you're saying to a new person that's kind of gone up through and gone up through a fairly similar route to you, what sort of skill sets are required to do your job?
Really good question. So I think in no particular order, real curiosity about the world. You've got to be thinking in a very interconnected way.
Okay.
So silo thinking is not good. You've got to understand. So just to give a little example, right? You've got to understand that if the rains fail in Burkina Faso, right,
Yep.
that might have an immediate, because 80% of the country is entirely reliant on agriculture. That will have potentially an immediate impact on migration into some of the other countries in the area,
Yep.
or potentially across even into Europe. That then has a politically destabilizing impact, which then potentially ushers in more populism. And so there's a huge interconnection between the politics of it, the economics of it, the climate issues, deforestation and sort of degradation of soil and biodiversity, and all of these issues kind of overlap and intersect.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd say the first thing, be curious about the world and understand that these complex issues are complex, and they're intersectional, and they are cascading risk. Okay, that's the first thing.
Okay.
Curiosity. Secondly, I would say
I put curiosity as your first one, and interconnectivity as your second.
I mean, yeah, okay, fair enough. So third, I would say, hard work's not really a particularly interesting one because everyone works hard, right? But I mean, I think you've got to be,
What about levels of an understanding of the levels of corruption in certain countries?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think
that's obviously curiosity as well.
I would put that into the intersectional risk.
Okay.
So, I mean, everything. I could take you through. We have 185 something risk issues in our data set, right?
Okay.
And they run everything from forced labor and bonded labor, all that sort of the labor rights stuff, through human rights and sexual minorities issues, all the way through to environmental issues and governance issues and political issues. So, understanding all of that there's a certain complexity to that.
Yeah.
Right. So that's definitely there. Otherwise, I mean, I would say interpersonal skills, the ability to talk to clients in a language they understand.
Okay.
And that means different things to different people, because I was in Stockholm and Copenhagen 2 weeks ago talking to our Nordic clients.
Right.
And that requires a particular vocabulary. I don't mean literally. I mean, you've got to be able to, you're talking to them in a language that they can buy into from a commercial perspective, from a legal perspective, from a kind of, sustainability, from an ethical perspective. And then, you go to Houston and you talk to some energy clients, you're having a very different conversation in a very different language. Then again, you're talking to Australian clients, or you're talking to clients in Asia Pacific. That's really interesting, and trying to steer your thought processes around the obstacles that might sort of come your way from those cultural differences is quite an important thing.
Okay.
So that's definitely something.
I'll give you one more.
One more. Okay. One more.
So we had curiosity, interconnectivity, cultural understanding, I would put it here.
Yeah. Is teamwork okay? I mean, because actually everything we do relies on teamwork. Yeah. How about that? And
so you're talking to someone new who wants to come into an industry of procurement, sustainability, and all of that. What would you say to them when they're starting their career off? How can I be you?
Okay, so I mean, first of all, you question whether you want to be, but I mean, let's say you do. Okay, right? Let's say you want a career in sustainability. Well, good on you, because that's exactly what we need. We need more people who are thinking about sustainability in a holistic way and thinking about how companies can be more sustainable. Because one of the key elements of the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights is the business respect for human rights, and that is an absolutely core foundational element of what we're doing. So great. So first of all, celebrate it. Fantastic. Good, you're doing it. Read widely. Don't get involved in social media. Read The Economist. Read, Chatham House's magazine. Go to as many lectures as you can. Read books about political economy and think about the kind of the complexities of the world. That will be a massive help. Then, I would make as many friends as you can with people like me. Not necessarily me, but look up. Use LinkedIn and think about who's doing the kind of jobs that sound cool to you, and maybe they're 20 years older than you, but that's okay. That gives you something to shoot for, and then look at where they've been. Think about what they studied. Think about where they've worked, how they got to their journey. Now, everyone will have their own journey, right? And particularly now that the pace of change that we're seeing at the moment with AI and machine learning and all of that sort of stuff coming in, and the world shifting on its sort of economic axis in terms of the relationship between China and the US and all the rest of it. There's just a ton of stuff going on that you've got to be thinking about. And so, but what I would say is a career in sustainability I think is always going to be a good thing, because what we mean by sustainability is always evolving. And it's becoming more interesting in many ways, because we are understanding that companies, in the commercial sector, and this also applies to the government sector, but just think about the commercial sector, right? Companies have such a massive role because of their footprint, their supply chain footprint, their operational footprint. If they can improve their environmental performance by 10 or 15%, and everyone does that as a collective, that's a massive step forward.
Definitely.
So it's a great industry to be in. Go find out who's doing the job you want in 20 years, and then retrofit what you think you need to be doing. Don't worry too much about university and the rest of it. Yes, great to get a good degree and all of that kind of stuff. But when I'm looking for someone, to come and work for me, I'm looking for someone who's got spark, who's got enthusiasm, who's got a restless intellect. And I don't much care whether they have a 2-1 in law from Leeds or a first in PPE from Oxford. It doesn't bother me. What bothers me is whether this is someone who's going to fit with our ethos, who is hardworking and committed and kind, and wants to work as part of a team. That's what gets me up.
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, what I will say is you're probably going to get an enormous amount of LinkedIn connections that will
They're very
connect
welcome.
with you.
They're very welcome.
So, going on to a little bit more granular detail here, how can companies balance the need for profit with a commitment to respecting human rights in their procurement process?
Yeah, it's a really big question, because when we think about sustainability, financial sustainability is a key part of that, right? No one is expecting companies to put themselves out of business in pursuit of sustainability. It'd be self-defeating. So we have to balance the need for making a reasonable profit with ensuring that your footprint is as light as possible environmentally, and that you're respecting workers' rights and human rights more broadly. Now, that's not just a nice to have anymore. This is a critical part of legal compliance, and increasingly a business norm that everyone is expected to hit.
Yeah.
So, balancing those things is exactly the conversation that's going on in boardrooms all over the place, because they're saying, to what extent can we afford to invest in this or that innovation in terms of cleaning up our supply chain? But there's also another part of that conversation, which is, to what extent can we not afford it? Because actually, if we don't go down this road and our competitors do, we're at risk now of being fined by regulators who are breathing down our necks about this. And also, we know that young people don't particularly want to go and work for climate polluters. They don't want to work for companies who are involved in human rights abuses. The best talent is going to go to those companies who are demonstrably ethical and sustainable. So actually being in that place is in your own self-interest now. And I think that there is a sort of short-term versus medium-term cost. I mean, long-term is the long-term, right? But short-term versus medium cost debate here. And it may well be the case that in order to make the jump from an unsustainable business model to a sustainable or more sustainable business model, it will take some upfront capital. However, if you think about a 3 to 5 year return on that investment, you may very well be able to see not just a sort of a kind of social return on your investment, but actually a financial return, because you will end up selling more product. There's all sorts of really good examples of companies who are making doing brilliantly financially and commercially because they're making a play of their sustainability. And we're seeing it in the fashion industry. We're seeing it in fast-moving consumer goods. We're seeing it across the sort of commercial sector.
I mean, it's interesting you said that. I mean, we are talking, a lot of those ones, probably examples are from the developed world. But if I was to say, with increasing pressure on companies to source sustainably, how do you think developing countries can effectively participate in global supply chains without being at a disadvantage due to their limited resources, infrastructure, and things like that? So, they're not on an equal footing.
No. Well, I mean, there's lots of parts to that question. We could talk about that all night. I mean, one of the things that is increasingly part of the conversation that I'm involved in, and that lots of other people are involved in, is about the idea of fair contracting with your suppliers. And so, rather than thinking about your supply chain as sort of a group of people to whom things are done, and on whom legal liability is placed, and to whom you're trying to sort of squeeze them as hard as possible. Actually, if you think about them as partners in your success, and you're facilitating that by upskilling them and making sure that your payment terms are reasonable and indeed as generous as they can be.
So it's fair trade.
Fair trade, exactly. Well, that's certainly part of it. But you've also got to bear in mind that this, the competition that here is not just within a particular company, a set of companies' supply chains. We've also got a sort of geopolitical competition going on between what's happening in China, for example, and what's happening in the US and the European Union. And those regulators are having an impact on those kinds of trade patterns. And the Chinese in particular are looking at the moment to get into particularly mineral-rich or resource-rich countries in the global south and impose their rules on what those supply chains look like. And that initially looks quite superficially attractive sometimes, particularly to kleptocratic governments who might be in charge there. But from a workers' rights perspective, from a human rights perspective, from an environmental perspective, it tends to be catastrophic.
Yes.
So actually we need
it's an imperialist approach.
Well, it is, and it's a debt trading approach, right? And all sorts of other ways. But we need to have a much more grown-up conversation about what we as the sort of industrialized West, if you want to call it that, what we think is a reasonable way to do business with companies in the global south. We need to be much more partnership focused, and we need to do much better at articulating the benefits of that kind of mutually beneficial trade and exposing some of the harmful trading practices that, I mean, I don't want to demonize China here, but they're particularly pernicious in some of this stuff. And now, obviously, we don't yet know where the US-China trade war is going to land, but make no mistake, it's underway. If you think about the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that was passed in the United States 18 months ago, that's having a massive impact on things like solar panel imports into the US. China has retaliated with its anti-foreign sanctions law. The US has retaliated again with the Inflation Reduction Act, which is essentially an invitation to reshoring massive amounts of supply chains. And things like that are actually increasingly part of the conversation that we're having in places like Maplecroft, because companies are saying, well, what do we do about the fact that we're now caught between these massive regulatory superpowers who are essentially playing a game of tit for tat? And the US can afford to do much of what it's doing because it's the global reserve currency and because it has this sort of power. And it's effectively playing the game that, or starting to play the game that the Chinese have been playing for 30 years. And they captured a lot of the renewable energy market, for example, in solar and wind, because they have been doing that sort of stuff for a long time. So, and how does that impact companies? Well, companies are sort of caught in the middle because they're being told it's your job to police your supply chains, but you're now caught between the US regulatory regimes, the European regulatory regimes, the Chinese regulatory regimes, and now you've got all of these suppliers in sub-Saharan Africa or in parts of Southeast Asia who are themselves sort of looking both ways and trying to understand where their bread is buttered. Right. So there's a lot going on here at kind of lots of different levels, and understanding how all that fits together and how it applies to commercial policy and decisions in the C-suite. That's the trick. That's the value that we try to bring to our clients.
I mean, I do feel a little bit that the fair contracting with clients is a little bit of a halfway house before, rather than actually going to those third world countries and actually, influencing the labour laws and the labour things, at source.
Although, I mean, so interestingly, we at Maplecroft, we have a sort of methodologically common approach to how we look at all of our human rights indexes, for example. We have 31 of them, and we look at structure, process, and outcome. as a tripartite way of looking at it. Structure is the law, effectively. How has a country imported the ILO standards, or whatever it is, that and they're scored against what they've done. But that's only 15% of the weighted score for us. 35% is process, which is, in other words, how are those laws being implemented? To what extent are the law enforcement agencies corrupt? Do they have a national human rights institution? That sort of thing. Okay. And then the 50% of the score is outcomes. So what's actually happening? And that's web scraped events data. It is reports from governments, etc. Now, the reason I'm telling you that is if you go and look at our country risk scores, for example, you can see at a glance exactly which countries have done what from a legal perspective.
Okay.
And you'd be really surprised. For example, in Nepal in 2007, they passed something called the Foreign Employment Act. It's a really, really good piece of legislation. I couldn't do much better myself if I was sitting down writing it from scratch in terms of protecting migrant workers. Okay. The problem is not in the structure, it's in the process. It's in the fact that it's not implemented properly.
So getting back to this human rights index, get my head around this and stuff. Each country in the world, you say, has a human rights index, or could be assigned a human rights.
We have 198.
Okay, so where does the UK sit?
On what?
On the human rights index.
You need to break that down. We need to look at all 31. So the UK.
Okay, out of 31, is it scored like if I've got 30? Yeah, I've done really well.
It's not scoring too badly across the board. I mean, where it's deteriorating, as it has been in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, on some measures,
such as
is in if you think about human rights generally speaking. Now, we picked up obviously the Modern Slavery Act was passed in 2015, which saw a sort of bump in the score. But the sort of anti-migrant rhetoric that has been very prevalent from the Home Office over the course of the last 4 or 5 years has caused things
to go down.
The score to go down a bit. But it's difficult to talk about a single country, because I could if I sat there with my computer show you exactly what the UK looks like in aggregate across all of the indices we have, but actually doesn't tell you very much, because what you want to do is you want to drill into a specific set of issues. But I could show you on labour rights, for example, or on the sexual minority rights, for example. Actually, UK scores very well on that. Certainly, if you compare it to other countries.
But on labour rights, then, if we were to say that, what would you? I mean, I'm putting you on the spot because obviously you haven't got the data to hand.
I don't know.
How would we sit on that?
In terms of structure, in other words, the laws that have been passed, good, because the UK has traditionally been an exemplar of decent labour practice, at least since the 90s. Okay. Minimum wage coming in, etc. So the UK scores quite well in terms of structure. Process, again, the police force. People complain about the police in this country, but actually, it's relatively uncorrupt, and it's
there's a few. I think. Well, there's a few issues that cropped up rather recently.
But that's why I use the term relatively. But if you can certainly compare it to many other parts of the world, the court system is transparent and underfunded, sure, but is well functioning. So there's lots of things about structure and process that are very good. The outcomes indicator fluctuates because, of course, that's largely driven by events. And so that's much more current. So every year, we get reports from places like Freedom House and the US government and Amnesty and Human Rights Watch or whatever, in addition to web scraped or unstructured data, which takes events sort of straight into the system. And that follows the trends much more closely. And there has been, unfortunately, a very significant downgrade in the way that the British government has been approaching human rights issues since 2016, really. I'm not pinning it on Brexit particularly, but the governments that we've had in place since then have shown a marked lack of respect for human rights in many cases. And so, we see, I have to be quite careful. If I say I'm a human rights lawyer, which technically I am, right? If I say that in the wrong context, I'm going to get my head kicked in. Because people
you do advisory stuff for the government, so maybe that it might be something that they appoint you for doing more work.
Well, I noticed that
depends on which government, of course, gets in next time.
That's true. It's worth noting that the UK government's anti-slavery commissioner. There's only been two. The first was Kevin Hyland. The second was Sarah. I don't know, Sarah. It's really embarrassing, but Sarah Thornton, she hasn't been replaced. So she retired, or she left the job 18 months ago or so, and the government hasn't replaced her, which tells you kind of how they see that role.
Okay.
And if you think about the way that the Home Office has been essentially weaponising the migrant crisis over the course of the last couple of years, this is really poor stuff from a human rights perspective.
But it's also poor from a cleaning point of view with Hawkeye, is that we actively encourage to have a diverse populace within our organisation, and so migrants are a key part of our workforce.
And Britain has been a very open economy for 40 years now, for 40, 50 years, and we've built largely because of our membership of the European Union, but also just because we are typically a very open, historically very open economy. Finance plays a big role, but we've always accepted that there will be a sort of ebb and flow of migration as needed by the economy. And of course, migration is a great sign. If you have a lot of inward migration, it's because there are jobs, and there is this rather. So I'm very interested in political narrative, because I think political narrative can be incredibly powerful. And there's two political narratives I'm going to refer to very quickly, if I may. The first was what's sometimes called the household fallacy, which was put about by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, which was basically that a government needs to be run along similar lines to that of a household. Correct. In other words, you cannot spend more than you earn, or that sort of thing. Now, that's just economically illiterate, right? But it's a very good story to tell to people because it feels instinctively true, despite the fact that it's not, right? The other story that we've allowed to sort of gain currency over the years is this idea that if you allow more people to come into a country, that there's a set number of jobs, and therefore the incomers will be taking the jobs of people who are here. This sort of it's a Malthusian or David Ricardian idea of a labour lump. In other words, there's a set number of jobs. More people come in, fewer jobs for those already here. It's nonsense. It's complete nonsense. Ultimately, more people come into a society. That means the pie grows. In other words, there's just a bigger pie for everybody. Now, that doesn't mean to say that some people may not necessarily lose out in the short term and in some sectors. That can be true. But over time, all of the evidence tells us that inward migration is good for an economy.
Correct. I mean, one of the key parts of Malthusian population checks was that people die. We have an aging population.
Right, exactly.
So I would agree with you.
Oh, no, just one other thing. If you ask people who say, "Oh, migration's too high," right? Then you sit them down. Okay, right? Who of these people would you remove? And you go, "Oh, care workers? No, they can stay. Fruit pickers? No, we need fruit pickers. Train drivers? Oh, no." And you go through the list, and eventually everyone says, "No, we need all those people." And you go, "Well, who are you going to get rid of?" And cleaners. Oh, cleaners, exactly. Right? Who are you going to get rid of? And then it's this typical thing of it's just sort of it's the other people. Oh, it's not. I'm not racist. But it's this sort of thing of. We want these numbers to come down, but we can't say why, and we can't say who we'd get rid of, because frankly, this economy, this country, has gotten so used to the ebb and flow of migration that to suddenly cut it off and then say, all right, we need British people to train to work in the fields or whatever it is that the government's currently saying is just. I mean, it's nonsense. All that's going to happen is that fruit is going to end up rotting in the fields, which is exactly what is happening. But also, people don't necessarily want to do those jobs, and they shouldn't have to. Britain has become a relatively high-skilled service economy, and for better or for worse, that means that a lot of the other jobs, the caring jobs, the cleaning jobs, they have typically been outsourced, if you like, to the migrant worker population, who actually want to do those jobs. They're coming here to do those jobs because it's something that it offers a better outcome for them than where they've been before. So anyway,
going. I mean, we could talk all night, but going into some other things that I wanted to talk about, really going on to the procurement of services and goods and things. And so, how would you balance cost effectiveness with quality when procuring goods and services for, say, facilities management? It's quite specific.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I don't think I have a particularly good answer to that. Cost effectiveness and quality. So cost versus quality is always the big thing, right? So how
cost effectiveness with quality when procuring goods or services in let's say a facilities management side. So a building and stuff will have a services catering and XYZ in it and stuff. So how would, in your view?
I really don't know. I mean, I like to think that I'll have a go at questions that I don't really know about. That's when I sort of feel like,
you can pass.
No, let's just have. I mean, I'm not a sort of regular procurement professional in that regard. I don't deal with facilities management stuff very much. I don't deal with regular procurement. I'm more in the sustainable.
But it's just interesting to know. You are a specialist in a very specific field,
Sure.
and it's very specific. And obviously, you would touch. I'm not suggesting you're a subject matter expert in FM.
Yeah.
However, you are a subject matter expert in procurement in a sustainable way. So there will be links.
Yeah, of course there are. And, I think the intersection of price and quality and security of supply and all that sort of stuff is a constant, right? And it's difficult to get the balance right. Your accountants will always be telling you one thing, your lawyers would be telling you another thing. Ultimately, the tone, I mean, I'm being slightly abstract here, but the leadership team of a company is really the one that sets the tone for this stuff. If they want to set a sustainable pathway for your procurement, then they can do so. They can set that tone and they can tell the lawyers and the accountants that's what's going to happen.
Do you think your battle is easier now than it was?
I think we're getting more of a hearing, for sure. And I think
I'm inclined to agree with you.
Yeah. I mean, so I used to get thrown out of boardrooms. When I go there and I'd pitch this idea of sustainability, people just laugh at you, right? It's 15, 20 years ago. No one's interested. Now it's core business partly because of the hard law. Let's not get away from it. Much as I wish it wasn't true, the fact is that now that there are potentially quite serious fines attached to non-compliance, you have the attention of people that you didn't have before. But you've also, I think, seen a generational shift in thinking. So, and that's partly, it may not necessarily be younger CEOs, but I think you've seen over the course of the last 10 years, certainly, a really marked change in attitude towards environmental sustainability, particularly. I think that's very much the kind of number one issue, but also a recognition that businesses do have a role to play in wider society. And so I think that's permeated into the C-suite quite significantly. Not in every case, but across the board, I think we're getting a much easier hearing than we used to. And also, we as service providers have upped our game as well. So we're no longer asking companies to jump through millions of hoops to get into the sustainability game. They come to people like us. We can give them really helpful dashboards and really good data that they can use for their reporting. And we can help them navigate these things so they end up not just with a more sustainable business, but with a more efficient business as well.
Okay. Good answer.
Do I win?
James, I always ask this question to people, and you can see it however you see fit, as it were.
Sure.
What is your biggest regret in your career to date?
Oh, where do I start? I mean, I try not to have regrets because, I think, well, of all of the mistakes I've made, and boy, have I made some mistakes, they are learning experiences, right? You learn from your mistakes far more than you do from your successes. So I try to take that attitude.
Give me just a couple.
I mean,
or even one.
Yeah, there have been times when perhaps I've stayed in jobs I shouldn't necessarily have stayed in, or I have taken people at face value when I shouldn't have done, or whatever. And I'm not going to give examples, but there have been times when I feel like I've been too forgiving of some certain circumstances, and it's only when you get into a better situation then you sort of realize actually how what that previous situation was like. So anyway, but there have been times when that's been, but very little, to be honest. I think about the journey that I've been on, and it's very easy when you sit looking back to kind of weave a narrative and to think about, well, I was always intended to get here. I mean, none of my career was planned in any meaningful way, right? I ended up where I am very largely as a result of chance and luck and a certain amount of hard work and what have you. But I think, I mean, I don't regret really any of it. There have been other things I've regretted, but sure, I'm pretty happy with where I am now.
Okay. And what would you say is your greatest achievements to date in your career?
Yeah, that's interesting. I do think about that a little bit, not because I'm trying to think about, plaudits, but just about, I sometimes go back to my 20-year-old self.
Okay.
And I think about...
What, before you were starting studying?
Exactly, right. And I think about that young man who was desperately lost and had no sense of the world, just that there was some possibility out there, right?
Someone must have sparked that possibility.
Yeah, well, I can tell you the story if you like, but it's very quickly. I went to America when I was 20, and my father had died when I was in my early teens, and he'd left me a very, very small amount of money, which I took when I was 20 years old, and I didn't tell anyone really I was going. I went on my own. This is the days before mobile phones or anything. So I literally just went and got lost in America for 6 weeks or so. And that opened my eyes to the possibility of the world beyond, And it also made me feel at once both completely insignificant, because I was thousands of miles away from home. No one would have cared if I'd fallen off the side of a cliff, right? But also at the same time realizing that, okay, I don't have to live in the shadow of the life I had. I can go and create whatever I want. Because when I was in America, no one knew who I was. I could be whoever I wanted to be.
I mean, what's interesting, James, is that, as a result of a dreadful family tragedy, it actually changed your direction of where you wanted to be in a very positive way. And that's probably a real legacy that your father has left for you.
Yeah, possibly. I think, I think about here's a regret for you. So I regret the fact that I never got to meet my father as an adult. And I think that, as particularly for young men, there is something about sort of almost physically looking your father in the eye at that level, and going to the pub with him or whatever it is, because it sort of marks that transition from childhood to adulthood to kind of, and you'll always be your father's son, right?
Yeah.
But there is, I miss that. I missed that transition, and I regret that. But nothing I can do about it. It's one of those things.
But I think the positives that have come out of it is really quite significant here.
Yeah, I think I became a risk taker then. I think I decided that there wasn't much to lose.
Well, losing yourself in America, quite a big continent, is quite something at that age anyway.
Easy to get lost.
Easy to get lost. So what things finally in life, could be work, could be leisure, that gives you greatest satisfaction and enjoyment?
This is the bit where I get to talk about my lovely 4-month-old daughter. So I came to fatherhood somewhat later in life than many. I'm 49 now, which every time I say that out loud, it just sort of doesn't sound right. The words don't quite come out right. But anyway, I am. There's no doubt about it.
Sounds worse at 50, trust me.
Yeah, I know. I've got that coming up next year. So anyway, so my daughter is the greatest joy of my life, alongside my lovely wife. And I am incredibly lucky to have been blessed at this point by such an enjoyable family. And my wife is from Germany, and she's from the most beautiful part of southern Germany. Her mum and dad were with us last week, and we try and spend some time down there in the shadow of the Alps, swimming in the sea, in the Bodensee, in the lake there. And I think about the joy that I get from those relationships, and watching her grow every day. And
great,
that's the best thing.
Thank you very much.
And playing the drums.
I'm playing the drums. Well, thank you very much, James Sinclair, Dr. James Sinclair, I should add. Well, thank you very much. That's our 14th episode of Wear Many Hats. We hope that you, our listeners, have found it interesting to listen to, as I have, interviewing James. We'd like to thank you for taking the chair, and I think it's been both thought-provoking, again with another angle of business, and we welcome the feedback from our listeners. So thank you once again, and tune in next time.
Thanks for having me.